Welcome to downtown Peacock Alley for Legislature today with our guest and host, Dale Wetzel. Before we get to our guest, talk a little bit about the great specials here at Peacock Alley. It's kind of a legendary historic place. Tonight's Tiny Tuesday. 2 for 1, what are they?
2 for 1 martinis.
Martinis,
shaken, not stirred, or actually stirred if you would like them stirred.
Yeah. I'm not a martini. I'm kind of a beer and a wine guy, so that's kind of tough.
Well, I'm kind of like straight whiskey, 5 shots in a row guy. At least not recently, though. And we also have $2 off the appetizers, which is, of course, that's quite tasty.
So if you're driving around and you need to come down and get something to eat, this is the place to do it tonight.
It is indeed.
We got a great show.
Keep the martinis down and eat as many of the appetizers as you can stand.
That's right. I don't get enough of those. So now, Dale, what happened today? I saw today was a busy day at the Legislature, and maybe you can give us, our listeners, a little bit of a. I get to get a little rowdy down there at the bottom of the floor down there, so we might have to.
Well, your hecklers have arrived.
That's problem. I got plenty of them. So
yeah, I do too. Actually, there's only a few of them, but they're growing and they're loud.
So Dale, what happened today? Today was a busy day. I could see by your emails going out.
Every day is a busy day at the Legislature. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of events. We had the presidential inaugural speech. We had the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. We had a bunch of. The thing that I'll remember the most about this day is all of the gun bills. We have lots and lots of gun bills. Where can you take a gun? Can you carry a gun in a church? Can you carry one in a school? Can you carry one in the state capitol? Do you need to get a gun permit, or do you just need a driver's license? The primary ones that were talked about today have to do with whether you can bring a gun into a school or a church if you have a concealed carry permit. Right now, under state law, you can't do that. You can't bring a concealed gun into a school or a church. What this bill would do is allow you to do that if you had a permit, and also if you had permission from the school, say the school board or the principal, or if you had permission from the religious leadership of your church or the pastor.
Wow. And
there were a number of reservations raised about this. For one thing, the school officials who testified at the hearing said that the principal of the school should not have the authority to allow someone to come into the building with a gun, that should be delegated to the school board or the ruling or the policy setting body of the school. I think that suggestion was fairly well received. Another was, frankly, the school, the Education Association represents the teachers, the school administrators, the school board association. None of them like the idea of bringing guns into the school. They prefer an alternative, which would be essentially giving them more money so that they can hire, they call them resource officers, which is a kind of a euphemism for a policeman who comes to the school and has a gun, is trained in its use, and that would be a better security measure than giving a teacher a gun.
Now, would that be kind of more in play for bigger schools? I mean, I grew up in Washburn. I would doubt they would have a resource officer in a school like Washburn. I assume these are the bigger cities that you'd be thinking where you actually got budget to support that, I suppose.
Well, one of the drawbacks to the resource officer option, it is expensive. Most small school districts, in fact, most school districts, period, I don't think have them. I mean, the city of Bismarck does. There are other school districts that do, but they're large ones, and these are districts that are large enough that they can spend money on that sort of thing. But if you have a lot of rural school districts, there's not those resources to do that. I mentioned that this is the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. We did have an abortion bill in the House Human Services Committee. What it would do, it would say that a doctor who performs an abortion on a woman strictly because the woman wants the abortion performed because for sex selection or because the fetus has genetic abnormalities, that would be illegal for that abortion to be performed, and the doctor would expose himself or herself to a Class A misdemeanor criminal charge, which carries a penalty of a year in jail and a $2,000 fine upon conviction. The sponsor of the bill is Betty Grandy from Fargo. She's one of the more vocal anti-abortion legislators in the North Dakota House, and she says essentially that abortions for that reason should not be countenanced in a civilized society. I'm not quoting her exactly, but I'm close. The people who oppose this bill say essentially that it is a decision for the woman and her doctor to make as to what the reason for an abortion is, and also that there are some genetic abnormalities that essentially result in stillbirth that are fatal, and that, you know, the logic being that if you have no chance for a live birth, why shouldn't you have the option of terminating the pregnancy? And that was the option. That was the argument that was made against that bill. There was a interesting piece of legislation about a gasoline tax decrease. I don't really give it too much of a chance of going anywhere, but it would cut the state gasoline tax from 23 cents to 11 cents a gallon, and the money that would be lost for road construction by that gasoline tax increase would be replaced by the general fund. And the advocate for this is Representative Larry Clemene of Bismarck. He's a Republican. He says that this would provide instant tax relief for folks because you'd be paying 12 cents less per gallon of gasoline or diesel fuel. But there's quite a lot of skepticism as to whether people would even notice it, because there's such a fluctuation in gasoline prices anyway that, you know, who knows if your 10-cent decrease is because of the normal decrease in gasoline prices during the season or demand or whatnot, or if it's because of a state tax cut. And there's also some uncertainty as to whether or not that tax cut would be passed along to motorists and whether it would just be, you know, kept by the fuel dealers. You know, frankly, there's enough stuff here. I could take up our whole half hour, so I think we should get to our guests. We have here this evening Representative Ed Gruchalla. He's a Democrat from Fargo. He's a former North Dakota Highway Patrolman. We have Representative Dan Ruby from Minot, a Republican. He is the chairman of the House Transportation Committee, which is dealing with legislation on speeding fines, whether to increase them, and that's what we're going to be talking about. We also have Colonel Jim Prochniak, who is the superintendent, the commanding officer of the North Dakota Highway Patrol. Colonel Prochniak, what is your opinion about how speeding fines and the level of a speeding fine influences driver behavior?
Well, I think it's best if I answer that, obviously, from the arena that I come from, and that's the enforcement side of things. What I can tell you, not only from my experience, but from what I hear our officers telling me, is just what Representative Gruchalla indicated. Particularly on those bordering cities that we have our officers stationed and they're working. Somebody comes across from Minnesota, and it's more like a free-for-all in North Dakota. The fine is the last thing that they're considering because they think it's a steal, for a lack of better terms. But let me say it from this perspective, and I think this is even more important. No matter what decision is made, and these folks here, our legislators, will grapple with that decision. Quite frankly, you have to be able to enforce it. And you have to, I'll just throw a wild number out there. Let's say a fine is $100, but if you don't have anybody to write that $100 ticket, or you don't have the resources to follow it up with the enforcement side of it, it's not going to do any good. So you have to have good enforcement behind that legislation. It's all part of a component that'll hopefully lead to safer driving habits out there and get people obeying the law.
Do the troopers on the road, if they see someone, say, going, 7 miles over, and they calculate it in their head that the fine is, $12 or $13 or something, whatever it is, do they think, it's not worth pulling this person over, doing the paperwork, taking the time to collect a lousy $10?
Well, yes. To answer it quickly, yes. There are times when that decision, quite frankly, is made, and that will be supported from my position on down. Let me give you the best couple of examples that I can think of. Whether it be a 2-lane busy highway, Highway 85, where there's a lot of truck traffic, or whether that be a 6-lane interstate where you have 3 lanes of bumper-to-bumper traffic bearing down on you. It's not worth that officer's life at that price of a ticket, or for that matter, a lot of the tickets they may issue, to get out of the car and risk life or limb. So they have to make a conscientious decision, and so that thought process does go through their mind as they're doing their jobs out there. Yeah.
To what extent, if any, does the Highway Patrol take an advocacy position for or against whether speeding fines should be increased?
Well, I like to think, and I've said this on various interviews, that of course we're the enforcement side of it. Whatever the fine folks in the chambers decide, we'll take that and go with it. I do have to say, in discussions with not only other law enforcement, but discussions within the Highway Patrol, that it seems like it's an issue that we have not addressed for quite some time, and that maybe we should look at it. I don't know what the magical number is for a fine, and I don't really want to get into that, other than, we get comments. Our officers get comments from people from South Dakota, people from Minnesota, people from Canada, that will say, $13, $15, is that it? And that leads us to believe that maybe there isn't a deterrent factor there.
Representative Ruby, I wanted to talk for a moment about the issue that you raised a moment ago. I don't think that anyone really would argue that North Dakota's speeding fines are too high, or that they're exorbitant. But there is, frankly, more of a discussion to be had about who should set speeding fines on certain locations. I mean, and I guess I'll ask it this way: should cities and counties that have home rule, which means they can govern themselves to a limited extent, should they be able to set their own speeding fines and not have the state do it for them?
Well, that is a discussion that we have almost every session. Certainly the cities, and there for a while some cities were setting their rates at a higher level than what the state allowed, and the Supreme Court ruling changed that, and they had to pretty much reimburse that back to whoever they could find that had paid the higher amount. So, that was for cities. If I understand properly, counties, their funds, just as well as the state funds, don't go into their budgets or their coffers. It all goes into the Common Schools Trust Fund. So, we get some criticism that, well, they just want to, raise some, make some extra revenue from these speeding fines. Well, the Highway Patrol doesn't get those fines. They go into the Common Schools Trust Fund. So the cities do get to keep theirs, and they would like to see it higher because of the what they look at as the cost to write the ticket, go through all the paperwork. The other thing is that the difference between in-state and out-of-state is we do have a points system where if you're over a certain speed limit, you can get points assessed to your license. But I don't believe that applies to anybody who's out of state. So they really only get the fine, which is a difference than what an in-state motorist would get, which isn't real fair, but that you can't apply it to their license because we don't issue it. So
just for the information of folks, the bill that you're considering in your committee, and you're chairman of the Transportation Committee, does it change the point penalties?
No, it doesn't deal with points. It also doesn't deal with running a stop sign, as Representative Gruchalla had talked about. We did have a bill a few sessions ago that kind of raised all of the moving violations, but that one failed in the House. So basically, this one came out of the interim committee with an increase. I think, I'll tell you the truth, I think this one is a little high to pass. I think we're going to have to rework it. There's some discrepancies between the different brackets that go in. Your speeding fine could go up, $3 per mile up to a limit of, say, 10 or 15 miles. Then when you get into that next bracket, it jumps like $20. So it's not very consistent or seamless. I'd like to see something, I guess, that's a little bit more gradual as you go higher, and maybe there's a limit of where you need to, once you cross that line, then it should jump more substantially. But so we need to work on it a little bit. I've been trying to work on the brackets a little bit.
Representative Gruchalla, you represent a Fargo district. What is the attitude of the city of Fargo specifically, as far as you're aware, as far as whether the city would prefer to set its own fines for moving violations rather than be restricted by what the state does.
If you were going to ask our chief of police and the city officials over there, they liked it when we had home rule and we were able to assess our own fines. And there's a difference between cities also, but when you get into a city like Fargo, when you have heavy traffic and high-speed roads, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour right in the city limits, they know that our fines are so inadequate that they're not able to make a dent in the enforcement end. So they feel they need that to actually have safe roadways. And every time we do a survey in Fargo, the number one complaint from the citizens is that is traffic and how bad the red light running is and all that. So the city of Fargo would say we need that back.
The bill, as Representative Ruby mentioned, the bill that is being considered in the Transportation Committee doesn't raise fines for stop sign violations or red lights. Do you think that should happen as well?
Well, again, there are some that are addressed in here in the bill. 3910 yield to an emergency vehicle is going from 20 to 50, and pedestrian is going up. So there are some that are going from 20 to 50, but I think we should probably try to make it a little bit more uniform, maybe, and just have one fee.
Colonel Prochniak, do you have any particular opinion about things like stop sign violations, failure to yield, that sort of thing?
Well, I guess as an agency, there are a couple of different items, and they're basically centered around those offenses that we see a large correlation to accident crashes. And that has to be the ones that I feel will make the most difference and that we take a look at. We always talk about how speed kills and you have to drive for conditions. So we're sensitive to speeding violations as an enforcement agency. We're also sensitive to right-of-way violations. Intersections, whether it be stoplights, whether it be rural intersections, unmarked, what have you. That's where we lose a lot of lives due to people not paying attention when it comes to intersections. And then, of course, anytime you start talking about some of those other laws about safety restraints and things like that falls into that safety arena, and we certainly encourage people to do that, even though it's not something that they specifically have to do unless they're under 18 years old.
One thing I haven't seen yet one thing I haven't seen yet is a primary enforcement seatbelt bill. Do you think that we're going to be seeing that this session?
It'll be scheduled next week.
Okay.
It's Friday, I believe.
Okay. Do you know who the sponsor is?
Mark Owens.
Mark Owens.
We're broadcasting live from downtown Peacock Alley. We're going to be going to the break. We've been talking about speed violations and those of you that drive too fast. And obviously need to slow down a little bit out in the streets, especially wintertime when it's icy. Come back to the break. We're going to be discussing gun rights and a lot of the laws in the books that will be coming up. There's a lot of bills in the legislature. Come back. We'll see you after the break.
I got to keep notes so I remember.
Welcome back to Peacock Alley. Legislature today. We're live down at Peacock. This is Gary Emmett filling in for Scott Hennon, who's had to go back.
Sick as a dog.
He had to go back to Fargo. He was sick today, so I'm filling in, and I guess I'm just the B team here filling in. So
you look very dapper though. You have
my collar shirt.
Had a no collar shirt on and kind of a corduroy gray jacket with narrow lapels. You look like a beatnik.
I had to dress up a little bit. My wife said, "Don't leave the house the way you normally do." So we got our guest. Come on in, Ben.
Yeah, we got somebody who's late. He's got the distinction of the first person in the show as being late. Now he's knocking his head against the line. Ouch! Greetings,
the late representative.
Hi there. I figured I'd be unfashionably late.
Oh, outstanding!
That's perfect.
You look very dapper, sir.
We're going to be talking about guns, so it's the wrong time, Ben, to be coming in late. You never know what some of these other legislators might be thinking about this.
I understand. I was actually just trying to escape from a legislative event, and everyone knows it's the hardest thing to get away from a group of talking politicians.
But here's the question I have. I was going to do all the legislators. I was going to have a weigh-in before the session starts and do a weigh-in afterwards. How many tons do you think are gained during the session by all the legislators?
How many tons?
That's what I'm guessing. I don't think it's pounds. I think it's tons.
I don't think it's tons, but it's more than a few pounds.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try to keep the weight off while I'm down here. I'm just going to drink Diet Coke and water, and
I'm
no
going to
appetizers.
try to gain a lot of weight. I need to gain weight. You see, I'm going to try to gain at least 100 pounds.
Well, this is Peacock Alley. Tonight is Tiny Tuesday. 2 for 1. What are they? Not daiquiris, not margaritas.
2 for 1 martinis.
2 for 1 martinis.
Shaken
that's right.
or stirred.
Shaken or stirred, and $2 off appetizers. So if you're out driving around, or you're finishing up legislator or lobbyist, or even just anyone driving down Main Street on a cold winter night,
yes,
stop down Peacock and get warmed up with those 2 for 1 tiny
2 for 1 martinis.
martinis.
Shaken, not stirred.
Shaken or stirred, depending on what you prefer. We're going to be talking this evening about a number of gun bills that are in the legislature, and a number of them were heard in the House Judiciary Committee this morning. Representative Kim Koppelman from West Fargo, a Republican. He is the chairman of that committee and the sponsor of one of the bills. We have also with us tonight Representative Roscoe Streyle, who is also a Republican from Minot, and he is also the sponsor of one of the bills that was heard today. In fact, Mr. Streyle asked for his bill to be amended a bit because he said he didn't want people to think that he didn't like cops. Also, we have Representative Ben Hanson. He's a new member of the legislature. He's a Democrat from West Fargo. He is on the Judiciary Committee, and he listened intently to all of the details of these bills that were presented. And first of all, Representative Koppelman, I'd like to start with you.
Sure.
Could you, the bill that you sponsor, it allows folks to have a gun in a school or a church under a certain set of circumstances, and could you tell us what those circumstances are?
Sure. It would be only in cases where they have a concealed weapons permit, and where the way the bill is written, that either the pastor or religious leader of the church or the church board allow it or request that person to carry a gun on the premises, or in the case of a school, if the principal or the school board allows it.
And Mr. Streyle, you had a bill in front of the committee today. It has to do with not so much, well, it has to do with the enforcement of gun regulations. Could you just explain what the bill does?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. A little bit of misinformation out there, but basically all it says is any state or local officials cannot enforce any federal gun regulation. And the penalty part was offered up an amendment today to soften the language. It was never the intent to go after the cops. And I think they're okay with the amendment should the committee adopt it.
Could you explain what you mean by what was it that was amended? What was it that the bill originally did, and how is it going to be changed?
Well, it's ultimately up to the committee, of course, but what the original one was a misdemeanor for a cop or a sheriff, for example, should they violate the law or any of their deputies, and it was intentional or put in to provide cover to them, to give them the ammunition they would need to tell the federal officials, we cannot do this because the penalty is so severe, we're not going to help you. Well, in thinking about it and talking with the sheriffs, we drafted language to make it a civil penalty where a citizen could file civil suit against the department should a violation occur of the law. Of course, it would have to pass. So.
And the police officials, they're all right with that amendment?
Yeah, that was at their request, and also taken out a few other words, minor words, and so I obliged, and it's obviously ultimately up to the committee should they agree. But
as I understand it, this bill that you're referring to refers only to federal gun regulations adopted after January 1st of this year. Is that correct?
Yep, correct. And that was kind of some misinformation out there. Is any of the existing laws, they can coordinate, collaborate, do whatever they want with the federal officials. Any new one, should it come out, obviously we don't have any at this point, but that's where it would stop them from doing that.
Representative Hanson, you're on the Judiciary Committee. You're taking all this in. What did you think about, first of all, the details of some of the bills? What were some of the details that you thought were particularly remarkable, if any? And also, what did you think about the sheer volume of the number of bills that deal with guns and gun rights?
That was the second aspect is probably the most striking part. I believe we heard 7 today. It was one of our longer hearings, and I'm new at this, so I don't know maybe what a long or a short committee hearing is yet. A couple of the bills were simple tweaks that we passed pretty immediately that seemed very common sense, just unifying, making existing law more uniform. The bills being sponsored by my fellow representatives here will probably create more discussion. I did wonder, I literally wondered, not knowing how the state could, well, I guess in the case of your bill, not instruct its law enforcement not to cooperate with federal law enforcement. I was under the impression that law enforcement was under the supremacy clause. I'm not a law enforcement expert, on the other hand, so I guess I'd like to give you a response. Maybe I should have asked today, but.
Well, depends on which part of the Constitution that the president wants to, abide by. If you look at Arizona, for example, was trying to enforce federal immigration law. The president of the United States sued him and said, "No, you do not have the right to enforce federal immigration laws." So, I mean, to me, it's saying is, the feds, you do whatever you want to do. You enforce your own laws. We're not going to help you. It's pretty straightforward, and I don't find any constitutional problem whatsoever with it.
So under this bill, we wouldn't be enforcing it, but we wouldn't be pushing back on it. B, if federal agents were in the borders of our state enforcing federal laws, we couldn't do anything, or this bill would not do anything to stop that. Is that, am I understanding that?
Correct, yeah. There was an amendment offered to your committee to stop them from doing it altogether. That's not the part of the original bill, so no.
Do you think you could even do that? Could you tell the federal government or federal law enforcement officers what to do? Could the state government give that kind of instruction to a federal law enforcement officer? I guess I'll address that question to you, Kim. Since you're the chairman of the committee, you have a heavy burden to bear here.
It's a good question, and it's one of those things that, as Representative Streyle mentioned, is probably the kind of thing that would end up in the courts. The Arizona example with immigration is a clear one, and it's that good old constitutional tug and pull about federal power, federal supremacy versus states' rights, and played out in many different stages.
How would you describe, all three of you, as far as your knowledge goes, how would you describe the state of North Dakota's federal gun laws, the regulations of guns and where you can carry guns, and under what circumstances you can have a concealed weapons permit? How would you describe it now? Do you think that our gun laws are too strict? Are they too lenient? Are they just right? I'll start with you, Representative Koppelman.
Well, I think we have reasonable gun laws right now. It always is good to take a look at those and find out, where there are issues. That's why I introduced the bill I introduced. I'm sure that's why Representative Streyle introduced the one he introduced. And of course, one of the things you look at is the landscape, and the federal landscape is certainly something that concern a lot of people. I think it's interesting to watch the fallout from a tragedy like we witnessed in Connecticut, and people approach that kind of an issue differently. Some say, this is horrendous, we've got to control guns, we've got to restrict ownership of guns, we've got to take guns away perhaps, although I don't know that that's the specific proposal out there. But others say, wait a minute, the problem is it was a gun-free zone. You can't carry a gun there, so that's a target. And so you have those two competing ideas and those questions. And, of course, we have the Second Amendment, which guarantees the right to keep and bear arms. I'm a supporter of that, clearly. I think most on the committee, probably both parties, are supporters of that. The question is, where do we go with this? And as you point out, some states have more wide-open restrictions. Minnesota passed a law a few years ago where you can carry anywhere unless there's a sign saying you can't. And so, we're not that far away from different approaches. However, I think if you look at North Dakota, we are a pretty gun-friendly state. I was in Texas recently at a Council of State Governments meeting, which I was formerly the national chairman of, and we were in Austin. We were talking with Texas legislators who were nearby, and they said, our capital's just down the road here, and by the way, in the Texas Capitol, you can carry a gun. And the one legislator said, and if you don't have a gun, we'll give you one. So some states are clearly very gun-friendly, exactly.
Representative Hanson, to what extent were you familiar with North Dakota gun regulations before you were elected, and what is your impression of them right now?
I guess I'd say I was fairly aware of, especially the conceal and carry laws. I live in West Fargo, so we often times come across border state situations, so I knew of the difference with Minnesota's law. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Minnesota's conceal and carry law does not allow you to for the place we are applying for with the county to consider it all. They simply have to give the conceal and carry permit, whereas in North Dakota, I believe the Sheriff's Department of individual counties can consider and take a look at either history or criminal record, background check. That's the main difference I knew. Outside of that, I really didn't know. I agree with Representative Koppelman that I think we have some very reasonable gun laws right now. While I was running for office, it was not a topic that came up that frequently, to be honest, and I talked to many people going door to door. But of course, at the time, we didn't have Sandy Hook in our immediate wake, although we did have the Aurora shootings, and in the more recent past, but still of unfortunate memory, are Virginia Tech, Columbine, on and so forth. So it was always there, it's always been present, but I always felt that people in North Dakota felt that they were still in a state where they did not have to lock their doors, and to a certain extent I still feel that we feel that, especially on the eastern third of the state. I have relatives out in the oil patch who don't quite feel that anymore, but it's not for gun problems, it's for, influx of many people who they might not know. So,
Representative Streyle, do you think we'd be talking about any of this stuff if it hadn't been for the Newtown shootings and the aftermath of that? And what I'm talking about is the willingness of the president to issue executive orders and talk about the need for more gun regulation.
I think you'd see some of it, but probably not to the extent we have now. In my opinion, we got a president that isn't real. He doesn't respect the Constitution like he should. So we need to stand up for our state rights. Like I mentioned today, it's the 2nd, 9th, and 10th Amendment right of our states to. And I think some of our laws could be loosened a little bit on the gun stuff. It is some of the concealed carry laws. I think we could loosen some of those up. If you look at all the shootings nationwide since the 1990s, when the gun-free zones got put into place, I believe 21 of the 22 are in gun-free zones. To me, it's statistics don't lie. There's a reason they're going to gun-free zones, because they know there's no guns there. So I fully support getting rid of those and getting more guns to protect the citizens.
I wanted to talk a bit about the testimony at the hearing this morning on your bill, Representative Koppelman, about the conditions under which one may have a gun in a school or a church.
Sure.
We had a pastor of a Lutheran church in Grassy Butte and Williston. He serves both towns. And he was there saying, we want this, we need this, we think that this would preserve life rather than endanger life. He also said that his congregants in Grassy Butte had endorsed something of this nature, and that congregations in Williston were going to be talking about something like this. We also had some citizens who showed up and said, if we have a law like this, then someone who comes into a school or a church with a gun will not have the same assurance that everyone there is unarmed. In fact, they might actually have the apprehension that probably one or more people are armed and they're going to shoot back.
Indeed.
But then we had also concerns from school officials primarily about they're worried about liability. They're worried about if the decision on whether to allow guns in the school is given to them, then they're damned if they do and damned if they don't in terms of a legal liability standpoint. And also, they appeared to favor, I think it's fair to say, putting police officers in a school rather than giving a gun to a teacher or a school administrator. And when I say police officer, the schools refer to them as resource officers, but these people are trained in law enforcement and they carry firearms. I wanted to know if you could talk about those arguments and what you think of their merits.
Sure. Well, I think I play a dual role here because as chairman of the committee, I preside over the deliberations of the committee as we take these bills up, and as you mentioned, I'm the sponsor of one of them, the one you're referring to. And that came from a real-life situation, as you heard today in my testimony and some other testimony. And it's the issue where there was a pastor in a particular church that had a death threat. And he, as a result of that, the congregation's response was to ask some folks who were very proficient and licensed to carry concealed weapons and actually were trained security people, so they actually have a current exclusion in the law. They're able to do this legally. That was a question that came up that's since been clarified and answered. But what the bill would do is allow any concealed weapons carrier, any concealed weapons permit holder to be authorized by the church or the school to carry a weapon. And when I first heard it, I thought it was the latter. I thought that they were just having people with concealed weapons permits do this, and I said, well, you might be breaking the law, but I'll try to fix it for you. And I did that not just to help someone that I knew, but because I thought it is a public policy question. Under current law, basically, we've created gun-free zones, with the exception of police officers, trained security personnel, and so on, as you allude to. And I think that's really a policy question the legislature should grapple with. Is it appropriate for the state government to tell every church in North Dakota, every school in North Dakota, you may not have guns present? We even get into the constitutional issues regarding separation of church and state, although I don't like that term because I think it's mostly misused. That's a whole other discussion. But the idea of freedom of religion is a government's place to tell a church what they can and can't do. And so those are important issues. I think there are merits to the discussion on both sides. Some of the liability issues you raised are good points. I think those are the kinds of things that we can have constructive discussions about solutions with regard to. A gentleman from the North Dakota Catholic Conference, for example, was there and talked about possibly putting in an immunity, a liability immunity for those kinds of decisions that are made. They're afraid of their insurance rates going up and so on and so forth. And we can deal with those issues, and those are things you might not think of out of the box, so it's good to have the hearing and talk about that.
Representative Hanson, what did you think of the merits of these various arguments? I'm talking about, the concerns about liability, whether there should be immunity for schools that allow this sort of thing, whether anyone with a concealed weapons permit should be allowed, with the permission of whatever authority needs to give permission, to come into a school or a church with a gun.
Well, when we're talking about liability with guns and with safety of children and those in our society, we're talking about a very real problem. When we're talking about legal liability, you're talking about some very real money, and it's something that should be very carefully considered and hopefully kept at the very barest minimum if we do pass it, especially considering a lot of these are public entity, and that is only going to be an increase in taxpayer dollars if you're looking at public schools. In regards to school, I'm sorry if tell me if I get my number of my answers wrong.
You're fine.
In regards to the school boards, it didn't really seem, to me, it did not seem that the representative from the School Board Association wanted that responsibility thrust upon the school boards themselves. And I think there would probably be some school boards that will want, some that won't, and I wouldn't estimate it to be a majority either way. I think there'd be individual communities that would say, oh, of course, we know exactly what we'd like. And we're a smaller 2,000 to 3,000 person town. We haven't had a problem. Dale keeps a rifle in the back of his pickup. If we had someone come into our schools, we know how to take care of it. Versus the West Fargo school district is going to be a much larger, much more complicated entity. And then you're going to bring parents into it who may feel the exact opposite. They may feel less safe having, especially if they're non-professional or non-security professionals, concealing, carrying, or feel that it's being thrust upon teachers, school board workers. So I'd want to make sure that those issues were hammered out, especially legal liability and this isn't, we're mixing national and local right now inevitably, because as we all mentioned, we probably wouldn't be talking about this if it weren't for Sandy Hook and the subsequent reaction by the president. But there seems to be a push closer towards getting more armed security, more security officials into especially public schools, which is in North Dakota maybe not quite as bad, but the country's broke. It's a large dollar amount hiring either staff or or getting the kind of liability coverage for those that aren't security professionals.
Representative Streyle, I wanted you to address this particular thing that was mentioned by both of the two previous gentlemen. The testimony that Representative Koppelman referred to, the gentleman from the Fargo church whose pastor was threatened. I mean, that man, he's a retired Army Master Sergeant, obviously had a lot of training with weapons and how to deploy them. And the church itself has a policy where the people who do have weapons inside it are trained in their use. But please forgive me if I'm wrong, or correct me too about this, but what your bill says, Representative Koppelman, is all you need is a concealed carry permit in order to, and the permission of the authorities in order to come into a school or a church. Like say, for example, I have a concealed carry permit, and I've never fired a pistol. I have no training whatsoever in its use. And according to this bill, I'd be able, and if I could talk my pastor into it, I could waltz into the school or into the church with a gun, and I would be a complete idiot if I pulled it out in some kind of dangerous situation because I have no training whatsoever. And what do you think about, Representative Streyle, what do you think about that in terms of what sort of training in firearms use should be required of someone who is in a church or a school, no matter whose permission he has to be there?
Well, yeah, I wasn't around for that testimony for that bill, but I mean, if you've got a concealed weapon, in my opinion, you've went through the class. Granted, some of them don't make you shoot a gun, but I don't know how you, what do you say? You have to shoot 10 rounds through it, 20 rounds through it. I mean, I don't know how a state would or a legislative body would set rules like that. I think you're going to have to go with just the concealed weapon permit. And if the churches and schools want to do it, I have no problem with that. I mean, we've got, if it's okay for the President of the United States and David Gregory, where they send their children to have 13 armed guards there, why is it not okay for us as states to make that individual choice, or the school districts if they want to have armed guards? I have no problem with that.
By the way, David Gregory is an NBC newsman who held up a empty gun magazine on a television show in the District of Columbia, I think in violation of the District of Columbia law, and he has not been prosecuted, and that's causing some consternation among some folks. Representative Koppelman, what do you think about, to what extent should training be required as well as a concealed weapons permit to go into a school or a
Well, as you
church?
probably know, Dale, we have two classes of permits in North Dakota. The Class 2, as Representative Streyle alluded to, requires they all require testing. And the Class 2 permit doesn't require proficiency, an actual shooting demonstration to show that you have the expertise to do that. Class 1 does, and so it would depend on what kind of permit they have. And I think the bottom line question we're asking here, to get back to the big picture, we're talking about freedom, we're talking about constitutional rights, and we're talking about local control, which is something we talk a lot about in North Dakota as well. So the real policy question here is, should the state make a law saying it is forbidden for schools and churches to allow anyone to have a gun? Or would you leave the kind of questions you're asking, Dale, up to that? That seems to me that's the question the school board or the church council or whoever it is should be asking.
We're broadcasting live down here from Peacock Alley. We'll come back from the break. We will have the credit unions with us. Stay with us.